I woke up to the sound of a full-blown wedding outside my window. Not birds chirping, not the gentle rustle of leaves, but the unmistakable sound of a DJ testing a mic and someone yelling about floral arrangements. I blinked at the ceiling, wondering if I was still dreaming. But when I sat up and saw the string lights draped across my barn and rows of white chairs set up in my field, it hit me. I was awake and someone was throwing a wedding on my property. Without my permission. I threw on a flannel and stomped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel as I took in the absolute circus unfolding in my own backyard. People were bustling around like they owned the place, moving chairs, adjusting decorations, even setting up a buffet table right next to my chicken coop. A woman in a pastel power suit, her platinum blonde bob stiff with hairspray, was barking orders at some poor teenage boy struggling to balance a stack of plates. I recognized her immediately. Karen Montgomery. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, notorious for her ability to manipulate, connive, and generally make life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her ridiculous sense of entitlement. Before I could even demand an explanation, Karen turned to me, flashing a smile so fake I could practically hear the plastic cracking. "Oh Jake. There you are. Don't you just love how everything is coming together?" I stared at her, speechless. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" She laughed, waving a manicured hand in the air as if this was all some delightful surprise party. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're just using your barn for a few hours. It's my daughter Ashley's wedding day. You wouldn't want to ruin that, would you?" I folded my arms, my patience already wearing thin. "Let me get this straight. You're throwing a wedding on my property without asking me?" Karen scoffed as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Oh come on Jake. It's just a barn. It's not like you were using it for anything important. Besides, I knew you'd say no, so I figured it was best to just move forward before you could object." I stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity. "You mean before I could stop you from trespassing?" Karen's smile tightened. "Jake, you're part of this community now. It's about time you learned how things work around here. We help each other. And right now I need your barn. Simple as that." I glanced around, noting the guests who had already started arriving. Some of them were sipping champagne, chatting like this was a luxury venue they had paid for. And then I realized they probably had paid for it. "Oh no way," I muttered, a cold realization creeping in. "Karen, tell me you didn't." "Oh, don't be so uptight," she said, waving me off. "I may have told a few people that this was a reserved venue and may have collected a small fee, but honestly you should be thanking me. I'm giving your barn exposure. Who knows, maybe you can turn it into a wedding venue yourself after this." I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to start flipping tables. "So let me get this straight. You charged people to use my barn. And you didn't think I'd have a problem with that?" Karen rolled her eyes. "It's not like you'd ever use it for something nice, Jake. You're always out here with your animals, doing whatever it is you do." I clenched my jaw. "It's called farming, Karen." She sighed dramatically as if I was the one being difficult. "Look, the ceremony starts in an hour. Why don't you just go inside, relax, and let the professionals handle things?" My blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. I looked around at the guests, the decorations, the buffet that was stocked with my beer, and an idea started forming. Calling the cops was one option, but honestly I had a better idea. A much better idea. Karen had invaded my space, disrespected me, and thought she could get away with it just because she was used to people folding under her nonsense. But I wasn't her neighborhood minion. I was going to remind her exactly whose land she was standing on. I gave her my best friendly smile. "You know what, Karen? You're right. I should relax. You go ahead and enjoy the wedding." Her shoulders sagged in relief. "See? I knew you'd understand." I turned on my heel and walked back toward my house, fighting the grin creeping across my face. The second I stepped onto the porch, four pairs of eager eyes looked up at me. My dogs, Bear, Moose, Tank, and Daisy, were already on high alert, sensing something was up. I knelt down, scratching behind Bear's ears. "All right, guys," I murmured. "You want to have some fun?" Bear's tail thumped against the porch. Moose let out a low, excited whine. Tank, the biggest and dumbest of the bunch, wagged so hard he nearly fell over. And Daisy? Daisy was already staring at the buffet table like it was a personal challenge. I reached down and unlatched the gate. "Go get 'em." The dogs took off like a furry tornado, barreling straight toward the unsuspecting wedding guests. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Moose went straight for the buffet, snatching an entire roast chicken off a platter before bolting away, a trail of horrified gasps following him. Tank, true to his nature, charged into the seating arrangement, sending white chairs tumbling like dominoes. Daisy made a beeline for the wedding cake, leaping onto the table and sending the entire thing crashing to the ground in a glorious explosion of frosting. But it was Bear who really sealed the deal. He went straight for Karen, barking loud enough to make her shriek and stumble backward. Her pastel suit, once pristine, was now covered in dirt as she flailed, trying to escape the determined, drooling affection of a 120-pound Newfoundland who just wanted to say hi. The guests screamed. The DJ abandoned his station. The bride, her pristine white dress now splattered with barbecue sauce from a spilled tray of ribs, burst into tears. And Karen, poor entitled Karen, was standing in the middle of it all, covered in frosting, screeching like a banshee. I leaned against the porch railing, sipping my lemonade as I watched the glorious spectacle unfold. Karen turned to me, her face red with rage. "Call off your dogs." I took a long sip, savoring the moment. Then with the biggest grin I could muster, I shrugged. "Hey Karen. It's their barn too." And just like that, the greatest wedding crash of all time had begun. The moment the dogs were set loose, the entire wedding turned into a scene straight out of a disaster movie. Guests screamed, chairs toppled, and the pristine elegance Karen had so meticulously planned unraveled in an instant. The barn, which had been transformed into a wedding wonderland without my permission, was now ground zero for absolute chaos. I stood back and took it all in, relishing every second. Bear, the biggest of the bunch, had taken an immediate liking to Karen. Unfortunately for her, his version of affection involved jumping up and planting his massive paws on people's shoulders. She screeched as he knocked her backward, her pastel suit now smeared with dirt and something that looked suspiciously like barbecue sauce. Meanwhile, Moose had his priorities straight and went straight for the food. The buffet table was no match for him as he leaped onto it, sending dishes flying. Platters of grilled meats, salads, and bread went airborne, landing on unfortunate guests who had once been sipping champagne and discussing flower arrangements. The groom, who had up until now been standing stiffly at the altar, looked like he was deciding whether to save his bride or make a run for it. He hesitated 1 second too long, and Daisy, the most chaotic of the group, made sure he was included in the festivities. With the precision of a trained athlete, she barreled straight into him, sending him toppling backward into the decorative fountain that had been placed near the barn doors. He came up sputtering, his tuxedo now a soaking mess, while the guests gasped in horror. Karen, on the other hand, had completely lost her mind. She was flailing her arms, screaming at the top of her lungs as she tried to get away from Bear, who was now convinced she was playing some kind of game. "Get this beast off me," she shrieked, kicking her heels uselessly in the dirt as she scrambled toward the barn doors. "You have ruined everything, Jake. Everything." I took a leisurely sip of my lemonade and smiled. "Oh, I don't know, Karen. Looks like things are just getting started." Tank had found a new interest, the wedding cake. It had been a towering, expensive monstrosity covered in delicate sugar flowers. Now it was his personal chew toy. He lunged forward, grabbed a huge chunk of it in his jaws and ripped it apart like a child on Christmas morning. Guests gasped as frosting splattered in every direction. The bride let out a strangled sob as the remains of her cake hit the floor. "My cake. My dress," she wailed, staring down at herself in horror. The once pristine white gown was now covered in smudges of red sauce, a victim of the flying barbecue platter from earlier. "This is a nightmare." Karen, despite her state, wasn't about to let someone else take the spotlight. "You think you're having a bad day?" she shrieked, whipping around to glare at her daughter. "I planned this wedding for 6 months. 6 months. I spent thousands making this perfect, and now look at it." The groom, who was still dripping from his unexpected swim in the fountain, slowly wiped water from his face. "Wait, how much did you spend?" Karen froze. The bride, too, suddenly looked interested. "Yeah, Mom. How much did you spend?" A guilty expression flickered across Karen's face before she quickly covered it up with indignation. "That's not important right now. What's important is that this man, ruined our wedding." She turned back to me, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You are going to pay for this, Jake. I will sue you for damages. I will make sure you never show your face in this town again." I let out a low chuckle and shook my head. "Oh, Karen. You really think you're in a position to threaten me?" The crowd, which had previously been panicking, was now watching with interest. Karen had a way of making herself the center of every situation, and this was no different. She puffed up, ready to argue, but before she could, a voice cut through the noise. "He's got cameras, Mom." Ashley, the bride, was staring at the barn with a strange expression on her face. "Jake's got security cameras. He probably has footage of everything." Karen's face went pale. "So what?" she snapped. Ashley turned to me. "You have cameras, right?" I took my sweet time before answering, enjoying how the realization dawned on her. "Oh yeah. High definition night vision audio, you name it. The best money can buy. I like to keep track of trespassers." I let that last word sink in. The murmur of guests turned into full-on whispers. The bride's father, who had up until now been glaring at me for ruining the wedding, suddenly looked at Karen like she was a stranger. "Karen," he said slowly. Did you tell us you rented this place?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It's just a barn. I figured." "You figured you'd pocket the rental fee, didn't you?" the father of the groom interrupted. He turned to his son. "Son, do you realize what this means? You just got married at an illegal venue." The groom groaned, rubbing his temples. "Great. That means our marriage license is void, doesn't it?" The bride gasped. "Does it?" I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. I could have told them that their license was still valid, that the location wasn't what mattered legally, but watching Karen's downfall was far too entertaining to interrupt. By now, most of the guests had turned against her. People were pulling out their phones, recording her frantic attempts to explain herself. She tried to regain control, waving her hands in the air like she was shooing away a bad smell. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. The wedding still happened. It's not like you need some fancy venue for a marriage to be real." Ashley, still staring at her ruined dress, looked up at her mother with something between fury and disappointment. "You lied to me. You let me believe we had a real venue. You charged guests for a venue you didn't own." Karen let out a dry laugh, but it was the sound of a woman cornered. "Sweetheart, you don't understand how expensive things are." "I think we understand perfectly," the father of the groom cut in. "You scammed everyone." Karen's face flushed deep red, but before she could spit out a response, a voice rang out from the crowd. The police just pulled up." All heads turned toward the front of the property. Sure enough, 2 officers were stepping out of a patrol car, their eyes scanning the wreckage of the wedding with barely contained amusement. The moment Karen saw them, she visibly deflated. I leaned against the barn door, watching as 2 officers made their way toward us. Well, I drawled. "Looks like we have some unexpected guests." Karen turned to me, her voice a desperate hiss. "Fix this." I grinned. "Karen, you're part of this community now. It's about time you learned how things work around here." And with that, the real entertainment began. The moment the police stepped onto the property, the wedding guests fell into a hushed silence, except for Karen, who was still fuming. Her pastel suit was stained, her hair was a mess, and her carefully applied makeup had been ruined by a combination of sweat, cake frosting, and whatever else the chaos had thrown at her. She spun around, trying to fix herself up, but there was no salvaging it. The mighty queen of the HOA had been reduced to a disheveled wreck, and I had a front-row seat to the show. One of the officers, a tall guy with a calm but unimpressed expression, approached me first. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, looking around at the absolute disaster of a wedding. "Mind telling us what's going on here?" Before I could answer, Karen pushed forward, waving her arms like she was directing traffic. "Yes. Officer, arrest this man immediately. He let his dogs loose on my daughter's wedding and ruined everything. He's out of control, a menace to the community, and he needs to be removed from this town at once." The officer barely glanced at her before turning back to me. "Sir." I let out a slow, satisfied breath before pointing at the barn, the ruined decorations and the destroyed buffet. "Well, officer, this here is my property. That barn, those fields, everything you see, it all belongs to me. But this woman," I gestured toward Karen, who was still breathing heavily from her outburst, "decided to throw a wedding here without my permission. She invited all these people, charged them money, and pretended this was a legitimate venue. When I found out, I figured I had 2 options, call you guys or let my dogs do the talking. I went with option 2. The officer raised an eyebrow and looked at Karen. Ma'am, is this true? Karen scoffed, folding her arms. This is ridiculous. He didn't explicitly say I couldn't use his barn. And besides, this is a community event. He should be grateful I chose his rundown old farm instead of an actual venue. The officer scribbled something in his notebook, then asked again, "Did you collect money from the guests under the pretense that this was a legitimate venue?" Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. I may have asked for small donations to help cover costs. The bride's father cut in, his face filled with growing rage. She charged us thousands. She told us this was a premium country wedding venue, and we paid for it. The groom's father, who had been quiet for most of the event, let out a bitter laugh. And she pocketed all of it. Unbelievable. The bride, still in her ruined dress, was shaking her head in disbelief. Mom, how could you do this? Karen turned to her daughter with an exasperated sigh. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Ashley. You still got married, didn't you? What does it matter where it happened? The groom groaned, rubbing his temples. Because it's fraud, Karen. This isn't some little misunderstanding. You stole from us. The officer cleared his throat. That's exactly what it sounds like to me. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Karen's face twisted in shock as if she had just been slapped. What? You can't be serious. I have multiple witnesses saying you misrepresented this venue and took payments under false pretenses, the officer said. That's fraud. Not to mention trespassing. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her mind scrambling for a way out. Then she turned back to me, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. This is your fault. You could have stopped this, but instead you let those horrible animals destroy everything. I'll sue you for damages. I'll make sure you never get away with this. I took another slow sip of my lemonade before setting it down. Karen, I don't think you get it. You're the criminal here, not me. You threw an event on someone else's property without permission, charged people for it, and then got caught. Now, I could have had you arrested the second I saw what you were doing, but instead I let things play out. No. Now you're going to deal with the consequences. Karen's breathing was erratic, her face twisted in rage and panic. You can't do this to me. I have influence. I have connections. You have the right to remain silent, the officer interrupted, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The guests murmured among themselves as the officer led Karen toward the patrol car. She thrashed and tried to argue, but nobody spoke up to defend her. The same people who had once scrambled to please her were now shaking their heads, some recording with their phones, others whispering in disgust. Karen's reign as the HOA tyrant had officially come to an end. Ashley was still standing in shock, her ruined dress sagging on her shoulders. I can't believe this, she muttered. My own mother. She ruined my wedding. The groom sighed and draped an arm around her. Honestly, babe, I think she saved us some trouble. At least now we know what we're dealing with before she tries to control our entire marriage. The bride's father let out a breath, shaking his head. We're getting that money back. I'm calling the lawyer first thing in the morning. I am a lawyer, the groom's father chimed in. And I'll be handling this personally. Karen, now safely inside the patrol car, let out a muffled scream of frustration as the officers closed the door. One of them walked back toward me and nodded. Thanks for your patience. We'll take it from here. I nodded back, watching as the patrol car slowly drove down the dirt road, leaving behind the mess Karen had created. The moment she was out of sight, the guests slowly began to disperse, some awkwardly grabbing their things, others still shaking their heads in disbelief. The bride turned to me with an apologetic smile. I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear right now, but thank you. I chuckled. For what? Destroying your wedding. She sighed, looking down at her dress before letting out a small laugh. I mean, yeah, kind of. At least now I won't spend my marriage under my mother's thumb. The groom smirked. And hey, if we ever want to renew our vows, maybe we'll actually ask next time. I grinned. Yeah, well, maybe I'll consider it if there's an actual invitation involved. As the last of the guests left, I turned back to my barn, taking in the absolute mess. My dogs sat near the entrance, panting happily, tails wagging as if they hadn't just caused complete mayhem. I scratched behind Bear's ears and let out a satisfied sigh. Well, boys, I said, looking at the remnants of the ruined wedding. I'd say that went pretty well. The town was going to be talking about this for years. Karen had finally met her match, the HOA had lost its tyrant, and my barn? Well, it had seen worse. But as I stood there watching the sun set over the wreckage, I realized one thing. This was without a doubt the most fun I'd had in a long, long time.